Missing? For how long?
Since yesterday morning. I thought he'd just gone out, but he didn't return last night. I've heard nothing from him and nobody's heard anything, and...
Calm yourself, Mrs. Lettering. Have some tea.
Thank you.
Now, let's start from the beginning. You noticed he was gone yesterday morning?
Yes. At first I thought he'd gone to the village or something, but when it was late afternoon and he hadn't come back, I became quite worried.
Are you all right, madam?
Oh, Mrs. Brown. Yes, My husband hasn't come in yet, has he?
I don't think so, madam.
This is so unlike him. Not to leave a note or tell anyone he was going somewhere.
I'm sure he just forgot. He'll be in by dinner, I'm sure.
Yes, of course. I think I'll go up to my room for a little while. Please tell me if Mr. Lettering returns, will you?
Of course, madam.
Oh, Charles. What is that? Mrs. Brown! Mrs. Brown!
What's wrong, madam?
Someone's outside! They threw a rock through the window!
Now, calm down, madam. Mr. Standish! Mr. Standish!
What's going on?
Someone's just thrown something through Mrs. Lettering's window. See if anyone's outside.
Absolutely shocking. What on earth is this world coming to?
Now then, madam, don't worry. Mr. Standish will take care of it. Come with me, and I'll make you some tea. No, I think brandy would be better.
But there was no one outside. The police came, but there wasn't much they could do. They said there had been various reports of vandalism in the village recently, and they didn't seem very concerned about Charles. They said people disappear every day, and there is usually no harm. But I know something dreadful has happened. You seemed to be the only person I could turn to. So I got on the first train I could and came.
Mrs. Lettering, I asked your husband this, and I'll ask you as well. Can you think of any reason behind this? Anyone who wishes you ill?
Not that I know of. But someone must. The letters and the dead animals.
Dead animals?
It was terrible. Dead animals started appearing at the folly. It feels like there's an evil presence watching all the time.
Tell me more about this folly.
It's a rundown thing. We came upon it one day quite by accident. Charles seemed quite disturbed, but I couldn't understand why. Then, of course, later he told me about the dreams. It seemed quite different after that. An atmosphere of evil.
I see. And how did you come to settle upon this particular house?
A friend of Charles's told him about it. Some distant relation who was moving to New Zealand or somewhere was selling it. Charles's family had to sell their ancestral home when he was a boy. We were trying to find a place to call our own. Fortunately, I have a very large inheritance, so we were able to get this quite easily.
I take it Mr. Lettering's family is impoverished gentry.
Yes. I don't know all the details, but there was lots of debts after Charles's father died. You do hear about that happening quite often.
Yes, indeed. And there's no one who resented you buying the house?
Not that I know of. I simply can't fathom any of it. I also brought these. I don't know how much Charles has told you, but we both started getting letters. These were addressed to me.
Yes, your husband showed me letters he had received. These obviously are from the same hand. And neither of you told anyone about these dreams? A doctor? Anyone?
Oh, no. Charles wouldn't dream of going to a doctor. We went to the police about the letters, but of course we didn't mention the dreams.
I think there could be a great evil behind this, Mrs. Lettering, and it is essential that I should come down to your house as soon as possible.
Yes, of course.
I believe there is a train leaving in an hour and a half. We should have plenty of time to catch it. Your visit has cleared things up a great deal, Mrs. Lettering. I now see a definite direction.
What direction?
The dreams are an interesting point. What do you make of them, Mrs. Lettering? Was your husband an imaginative sort of man?
No, not at all. He's not the sort of person to be frightened by dreams. In fact, it's quite the opposite. That's one of the reasons it frightened me.
I'm curious about your staff. Have they all been with you long?
No, not really. We engaged them when we bought the house, but they all have good references and are highly respectable. You think one of them might be involved?
There doesn't seem to be any motive for them to be, certainly. But one must explore many avenues. Now, the first thing I intend to do at your home is to see this spectral of the dreams, the folly.
Well?
It was quite ordinary. As you said, rather overgrown, but utterly unremarkable. However, I did discover this.
It's one of Charles's handkerchiefs.
Perhaps he dropped it there.
But what on earth would he be doing there? Something must have happened to him, Mr. Holmes.
Calm yourself, Mrs. Lettering.
Excuse me, madam, but I wanted to tell you that tea is ready. Are you all right?
Yes, I'm...
Perhaps you'd better lie down for a while, madam. I'll bring some tea up to you.
I think that's an excellent idea, Mrs. Brown. Once you've attended Mrs. Lettering, would you be so kind as to have a word?
Certainly, sir. Well, I think she's all right for the time being. She's resting.
You seem very capable, Mrs. Brown.
I do my best, sir.
I do have some questions to put to you.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell me about Mr. Lettering's behavior lately?
Well, he was very nervous and upset, quite unlike his usual self.
He had a cheerful disposition?
Well, he's a very steady sort of person. Certainly not what one would call nervy. I didn't know all the particulars of what was happening, but, of course, one hears things.
What did you hear?
Well, I know there were threatening letters of some kind.
Mrs. Brown, I understand that discretion is a worthy trait, but now is not the time for it. I would like your observations.
Yes, I quite understand, sir. As I said, I didn't know all the particulars, but they have both been in a terrible state of nervous strain. Mrs. Lettering has gotten herself into the most incredible state. Not that I blame her, of course. Someone is obviously playing very nasty tricks. Breaking her window and such. Being in a small village as we are, everyone knows something is going on.
Apparently not all the staff are as discreet as you.
Unfortunately not, sir. I'm positive the wretches glue their ear to doors. Of course, as nobody really knows the full truth, there are lots of half-baked rumours.
Such as?
Well, not of course that I go in for gossip.
Of course not.
But I have overheard things. That the house is cursed, that Mrs. Lettering is going mad.
I see. Is that what you believe is happening?
I'm certainly not saying I believe the house is cursed, but I must say, something very odd is going on. The master disappearing, and the mistress on the edge of a nervous breakdown.
There does seem to be something very wrong here. I trust I can take you into my confidence.
Oh, of course, sir.
I believe that Mrs. Lettering is in the gravest danger, so I am entrusting her safety to you. Keep a close watch and let me know immediately if anything out of the ordinary occurs.
Danger? What kind of danger?
I can't be sure, but I leave her in your capable hands.
I will do everything I can, sir. I don't think anyone can get into the house, if that's what you're worrying about.
I don't doubt it. I will be returning to London this evening, but will return tomorrow. I plan to take up residence for the time being, as Mrs. Lettering is in extreme distress.
I quite understand, sir. Goodbye, Mrs. Lettering.
Don't move, Mrs. Brown. Drop the gun, and put your hands in the air immediately. I'm afraid Mrs. Lettering is not here. Your performance, though impeccable as always, is over, Mrs. Brown. Or should I call you Miss Jones?
But, Mr. Holmes, what I don't understand is why Mrs. Brown wanted to kill me. And why would she send the letters? The whole thing doesn't make sense.
Only when you look at it the way it was designed to be looked at. That was part of the point. It was supposed to be strange and unexplainable, like a magician's trick.
But what was happening? I don't understand.
Prepare yourself for a shock, Mrs. Lettering. It was curious how the letter writer knew all about the details of the dreams. It suggests that only a few people could have written them. It soon became obvious to me that it was your husband himself.
Charles? But that's nonsense. Why on earth would he do such a thing?
Because of your inheritance. A man from an impoverished family marrying an heiress is leapt to the eye. His disappearance was to ensure he was absent when the crime was committed. But then, presumably, there must be someone else in the house to do the deed. When I met your so-called housekeeper, I knew.
But how? I never would have suspected her.
Because I recognized her. Not as a housekeeper, but for who she was. An actress. A well-known actress, as a matter of fact. Expertly made up, but undoubtedly the same person. Flora Jones.
Wait. I remember she was at a party.
Coincidentally, she is taking a sabbatical from the stage, supposedly due to her health.
But why would she agree?
Because she knew your husband, long before he met you. When the opportunity presented itself for him to marry a wealthy young woman, they planned this entire charade. In due time, they would murder you and he'd collect the inheritance.
I simply can't believe that, Mr. Holmes. You don't know Charles.
I know that at this very moment he is undoubtedly checked to some mental institution due to his dreams. While he established this alibi, Mrs. Brown would murder you and your death would be made to look like a suicide. Would anyone question it? Your husband stirred your imagination to put you in a state of nervous strain. Rumors were circulated how you were on the edge of a nervous breakdown. When your husband vanishes, it pushed you to the breaking point. You shot yourself. Even if someone suspected foul play, your husband was nowhere near here at the time. There wouldn't appear to be the ghost of any other motive. He'd remarkably recover, Mrs. Brown would disappear, he'd collect the inheritance, and in due time marry Flora Jones.
I thought the nightmares couldn't get any worse. But if this is true, I'm living in the worst one of all.
But there is something to be said about nightmares, and that is that we awake from them, as you're sure to do in time. So, Mrs. Hudson, by circulating the false reports of Mrs. Lettering's death in the papers, her husband was drawn into the waiting arms of the police.
I never would have guessed it. He seemed scared out of his wits.
A performance no doubt garnered with the assistance of Miss Jones, two most cold-blooded villains.
It's very fortunate you're around, Mr. Holmes.
A more modest person would tuck that away. But it is quite true, Mrs. Hudson. Fortunate indeed. Thank you for listening to this audio drama production of Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Nightmare. This audio play was written by Caleb Bressler and Della Carr. Our cast in order of appearance was Sean Mendham as Charles Lettering, Maddie Albretts as Mary Lettering, George MacArthur Conroy as Victor, Andrea Richardson as Mrs. Hudson, Caleb Bressler as Sherlock Holmes, Dee Cassilian as Mrs. Brown, and Caleb Bressler as Mr. Standish. Script consulting by Mulkey. Thanks for listening.